and welcome to the first episode of Beyond Stereo. Thank you for coming. I've got Caroline here from Universal Music Group. We're going to be discussing Dolby Atmos, immersive audio, and all of the things therein. Hit the subscribe button if you want to watch the next few episodes. And yeah, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
This is our first ever episode. We've not really done this before, but please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thanks very much for having me. It feels like a real privilege to be here, and doing the work that we do at Universal, I can appreciate it can be contentious for some, but has been really positive for others. So so I essentially head up a team over at Abbey Road Studios, working for our global business to basically work with and support all of our labels, our artists, the engineers, in how we're delivering this format. We've been working with Dolby for the best part of, kind of 6-7 years from the moment they said, we want to try and use this format for music, and we went, okay, but obviously it's a very different offering than for film and TV, and so we really worked with them on that. R&D, mostly a lot of my colleagues over in LA and Nashville and New York, all part of that team, working together to try and understand what this format is, how it's going to work in music, and what we could do to help be part of the team of people that kind of inform right at those kind of early stages, trying to work through all the mistakes so no one else had to, essentially. And that's how we kind of got to it, really.
So yeah, your work, for people who aren't aware, your work was really influential on probably everyone at my end of the chain, so people producing Dolby Atmos. You helped to produce a document, the Universal Dolby Atmos specification guide, which I normally have printed out on my desk. It just sits there. It's well thumbed at this point. What brought that about? What led you to think we need to produce a document that mixers can use to produce Atmos mixes for us? I
think that's it. I think if you look at it from, a very basic spec, it can look very much like, and I know this is more of a British reference, but, computer says no, right? So when you just look at it as a bunch of numbers without context, I don't think that's helpful. And so we worked with Dolby to kind of say, look, we work together on these specs. We're very happy with those. But we feel that we need to take it that extra step forward of going, we need to add a bit of best practice into this, a bit of recommendation, suggestions, some are more mandates, because we've worked through this. We've tirelessly gone through all the pros and cons of this setting versus that setting, that level versus that level. What are those tolerances? And really to just say, we've worked out that if you do this, it's because this happens. But if you do this, this happens. If we just say, make sure it's this, then people are just saying, well, why? And so we're trying to answer the whys, really. And again, we've gone through that. We do not do this in a vacuum. We've been working with engineers such as yourselves, our internal engineers, external engineers, to kind of go, this is what we're looking at doing. Do you think this all makes sense? And it's generally been positively received, which has just been really good to hear. And it's lovely to hear that, you've kind of got it there.
It's there. I refer to it. I mean, I almost say I know it off by heart to a point these days. It was instrumental when I got started working in Dolby Atmos. We were just referring to various pages on it going, okay, so this has to happen, this has to happen. And we kind of produced our own internal documents of kind of workflow and then that helped to then building templates. But it was all built kind of out of working with that document. So thank you from our point
thank
of
you.
View.
That's
definitely
really good to hear.
Obviously, I think we've kind of skipped over it a little bit, but we should talk a bit about how you got into where you are now, how you got started in music, because you didn't obviously walk into Universal and become head of doing Dolby things. You've worked in mixing, you've worked in that end of the chain as well.
It's been a really interesting journey, a difficult one, but an interesting one, and not what I ever envisaged for myself. But yeah, I think like most engineers, you as soon as you get a kind of taste for it, say 13, 14 years old, singer, songwriter, all that kind of stuff, session player, this, that and the other, and then you start going, okay, start buying kit, and then I have to say I was quite fortunate that even at kind of, 15, 16, we had a music teacher that was very much up on his tech, built a studio at school and all that kind of stuff. I was able to do one of the first music tech A levels, all that kind of, it's revealing my age at this point. Slowly building your home studio, getting the qualifications, and then starting to become an engineer. But I'm definitely not the same person that I used to be, and which I have no regrets, but it became quite frustrating. It was very, very common on a daily basis of being asked where the sound engineer was, because it couldn't possibly be me. So I didn't have the confidence that I probably do have now, to really push forward with that. So I stepped away from it. It was just a lot to handle. You have to prove yourself so much more on a daily basis. It's exhausting. Yeah. And so I don't have regrets, but I absolutely want to make sure that I'm doing the best that I can to help support younger people now be able to elevate themselves and retain the confidence to be able to go through it and be successful in that career. So weirdly, I ended up in artist relations, which is a department that you generally find in the three major record labels, at the time the fourth at EMI. And that was great, to be honest. I fit into it because I had been one, and I'd been an engineer, and I've been on that end of it. Yep. So I wasn't coming in as a marketeer or someone that hadn't quite had that experience on that artist level. So it already set me up in kind of how to communicate on that same kind of level, to the point that actually when I left, when, funny enough, Universal then bought EMI, I stepped away and went freelance for a few years. It actually intrigued me so much that I went back to university, got a psychology degree, found that so interesting that I went and did a master's in cognitive neuroscience, which also then allowed me to get a bit more of an understanding of what the brain's doing, how we're interpreting sound, how we're, all these kind of things. Bonkers journey. I don't believe it myself, and I pinch myself often, because again, you have to have the confidence to say I can do this. But at the time I was a bit like, I don't know where I'm going, I don't quite know what my career's doing. I was doing a lot of consultancy work, funnily enough, for Universal, and and one of those happened to be a project for Decca about 5 years ago, where we were looking at this high-res product that we were going to release. And then someone said, well, have you considered Dolby Atmos? And I said, what's that? And so that was 2017. Yeah, so
okay. 6 years ago.
6 years ago. Next thing I know, I'm sent over to LA to go and speak with the team who had started working on the R&D. So working with who are my colleagues now, and came back. We kind of rolled out that project. That wrapped up. And then I inadvertently became someone that was fairly competent in my knowledge base of this format. So when it finally came to, we are now ready to roll out, we've done the work, we're ready to start rolling out this format and working with our artists on this format. And we're like, who was that lady that came to visit us? Because we need someone in the UK. And that was it. I got the call, and it kind of just blew from there. That's probably a very long-winded way to tell that story.
It's funny, we were talking off camera earlier about how we all have weird little kind of small links to each other. I also did a degree in psychology.
Did you really?
Yeah.
There you go.
The world is full of tiny weird little things.
Definitely.
You still have a role engaging with artists and kind of bringing them on board with Dolby Atmos and immersive mixing and all the various things that they can do with this technology. What's the response been like from artists?
It's absolutely been mixed, and we're not just talking about the artists, we're talking about the labels, we're talking about the original production teams that have worked on those albums, etc. So there have been challenges with it, but there's been a lot of excitement with it. What generally happens is, once I can get them in my room and we can sit down and have a chat about it, and I can play it to them and I can demonstrate to them how it works and what it does, usually people leave quite happy. It's the not knowing and getting the piecemeal information about this format. And because historically we've had so many formats that it's just one gimmick after another, after another, after another. And so people do come with it with, okay, so how long is this one going to last? It's like, no. This is so extremely different from any of previous formats or ways of delivering music. than ever before. We have a digital pipeline. There's a way in which it can get to any ears on any device one way or another. And because of this object-based mixing as opposed to channel-based, it's a much more flexible and fluid kind of format. So it allows that translation across devices and different experiences, really. Yeah. So yes, I definitely remember having, producers coming in going, we spent 3 months on that track and you've just gone and done it in 5 minutes. And it's like, respectfully, it's because you spent 3 months on it. And no, it doesn't take us 5 minutes. But obviously, yes, it's taking a lot shorter time than 3 months. We're retaining your creative intent. That's at least where we are at the moment anyway. It's the baseline from where we have to start from until we really have artists really grasping the technology. Someone like Brian Eno, for example, working with Emre Ramanazoglu, he's saying use the artistry of the space, and go wild, and retain what you see as my message, but it doesn't have to be to the constraint of what I did within stereo. But in most cases, we are still at a point of going, well, the artist is still unclear on this format or still unsure on it. So, as we generally, if we don't have any other guidance, we go by the creative intent that is already there in the stereo master. Yeah. So we're retaining what mixing essentially happened, what mastering essentially happened, and not saying no, we're constraining it to 2 speakers. We're going to take that and give it the breath in the air of the wider space, but it is ultimately still your track. We have not deviated from what you intended, And so when they see that and when they hear that. There's a bit more of a, kind of deep breath and relax. And so, generally positive.
Good. That's pleasing to hear. We've had mostly the same kind of experiences here. People can be a bit trepidatious before they've heard something, and then you bring them into the room, you play them some music, you show them what it sounds like in Atmos compared to what it sounds like in stereo, and you say, look, it's still the same. If the song is there, I've just used the song to guide my decision making,
exactly,
and let that take the lead.
Yeah, exactly that. And I think that's it. And like I said, this is going to be a format that's really not going away. There's been far too much investment from labels, from device manufacturers, from the streaming platforms. Everyone's heavily invested into it to get it right. And of course, we're still not there. It's still a baby, right? So it's still got a long way to go. So as part of that, mixed techniques are there to be worked on and developed. All we're trying to do is save a lot of the pain that may have happened in stereo when people were playing. And we're saying, don't stop playing, but just understand that the potential of some of that could have dramatic implications that may not work well for the mix itself and may not work well for the artist. As and when people become more familiar with it and it becomes a standard format, it's going to step up a level. People are going to have much more freedom to do what they're doing. There's going to be far more interaction with the artist or the original production crew, and it will become part of the convention.
Yeah, we've started doing a small handful of jobs where I would say the intention from the very beginning of production has been for it to be an Atmos mix. Have you seen much of that with artists you've worked with?
Yeah, so we're starting to, and I think that's the point of what I'm making. There is nothing to say the Atmos can't be first, or that the Atmos can't be considered in the recording and the creation process. So we're starting to do that with more artists. I mean, there is a lot to learn from the classical world. I think there's this kind of preconception that classical is old school, and it's like, no, classical engineers are some of the most sophisticated because they've been so much more used to, sorry, no disrespect, I mean, maybe you do classical, I don't know, anyway, so but 5.1, 7.1, all of that's been done high res, always delivering high res. Mic techniques,
yes,
how you record a room, all of these things. There's a lot to learn from the classical world because all of that can be applied into that pop recording, into that rock, into that band recording, all that kind of stuff. A lot more of that stuff can be maintained. And then on the producer side of it, and kind of the computer-based, music making, again, it's all those considerations of where do I visualize that sound as I'm writing it, so then we've already got those notes and we already know where someone wants things to go. The vision is already there. So all of that is piece by piece, which is why I say we're still in very, early grounds. It feels like everyone feels like, oh, we've been doing this for years now. But the reality is we haven't got to the point where we haven't got kind of the standards being fully followed, because some would argue, well, how do you know that's what the standards are? And that kind of stuff. So we're still everyone's still finding their feet. So yeah, I think there's absolutely going to be a lot more of this to come, and that then kind of takes us on to that step of bringing in mastering more so in that kind of conventional way of mix engineer, mastering engineer. At the moment, we've predominantly got mix and mastering engineer in one.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that will develop as part of that process as well. So it becomes part of that convention.
Yeah. So that's obviously something that we've been working quite a lot at. Obviously, Metropolis, we've got a very well thought of mastering departments with some of the biggest names in the UK, at least. And it was a thing with Dolby, wasn't it? When it first kind of got going, mix engineers were having to do their own mastering. And as you point out, a lot of that was able to be done because of the document that you put together. There was a series of specifications to which they had to work. That we're moving a little bit away from that. We're starting to see more people using mastering more for what mastering used to be used for. Yeah. Over the last 10, 20 years, however long it's been, mastering has become a very, I guess it's always been niche. But with Dolby Atmos, it allows us as mastering engineers to work much more how we would like to work. So one of the things I'd like to talk about, obviously Dolby's got some very strict loudness specifications. There's a minus 18 LUFS for your loudest track on an album. I certainly have ways that I use for working around that. What are your thoughts on that, on loudness and on...
I think we've moved on a bit more from having the daily conversation of why can't I slam this at minus 10? And I think, the engineers have become sophisticated enough now to understand that once you do that, you lose that dynamic range. And dynamic range is one of the most important aspects of the psychoacoustics of understanding your sense of space. That's just one of them. Frequency representation is another one, and all the various aspects of the best ways to create the immersive space. So as soon as we start squishing everything together, it becomes harder to discern where things are. It's pretty much that. I know some will argue, oh, no, it's not quite that. I'd be like, well, okay, but in basic terms, that's where we're at. So yes, minus 18 is a good thing. And the reality is, and I know, again, might sound slightly contradictory, the reality is once it ends up on the streaming services, they are doing some form of normalization. So again, I get the point, but where the stereo and the Atmos will sound as though they're at the same level. It's generally more. It all depends on where you're listening, whether it's device based or stream server side and all that kind of stuff. So there doesn't have to be that worry that your mix is going to be really, really quiet, and it really does add to the beauty of a good mix.
It's huge the difference it makes, and on styles of music that people will swear, have to be squashed and have to be loud. I've done some drum and bass records in Dolby Atmos at minus 18.
Yes.
And you're like, have I used a limiter? Yes.
Yes.
Did I smash it? No. I'm tickling it.
Yeah.
I'm using it to get a sound because, the Stereo Master has a sound and I want that density, but I don't need it to be minus 6. And then you flick between the two, level matched.
Yeah.
You're like, even just if you just hit the stereo button and you flick between the two, you're like, I know which one I'd want to listen to every single time.
Absolutely.
And it's not the smashed one.
I think that's exactly it. You can still retain that sound and that energy and that punch and that, smash in the chest. That's all still possible. That's not what it does when you make it quieter overall.
No. And it's that thing of the tools are still there. You can still use them.
Exactly.
If you need to get that sound, the tools are there. Make it that sound. Minus 18 is an average loudness, it doesn't say your peaks have to be hitting 0.
Yeah.
In fact, -1.
Yes. Well done.
But you don't have to be anywhere near that. You could be at -12 if you really need that specific squashed sound. It's just that I've never heard a mix where I do need that.
Yeah. No, exactly that. And so I think that's it. That's part of why I'm really excited to see where we go with mastering, because I think we're still at a point where everyone's like, well, what is mastering in Atmos? And it's like, well, to your point, there are conventions and traditions of what we do in standard mastering, and essentially the same is being applied. Yes, you're working across more channels, and that can be quite convoluted. But it is that convolution that makes me say, and that's why it should probably go to someone else. Give them the opportunity to do that, so you're not spending your time on those really kind of those nuances of the finessing technical aspects that, yes, have an effect on your sonic representation, but I guess what I'm saying is, get it to absolutely where you want it to be. And there's going to be situations where it might require the other person. I mean, in a way, I would love, us to get into more of a traditional kind of mastering workflow, because it means there's at least another person that's, kind of listened to this before it's gone to the final, the kind of final audio prover. I mean, part of why we take our QC process so seriously is because we're really aware that mastering engineer isn't always there.
Yeah.
So we want to be able to go, did you mean for that to not be there? Was there a specific request from the artist to, not include that element, or to add that element, or whatever else it might be? Or our QC very much has been put in place with the robustness that is there to support the engineers. It's not to reprimand them. It's not to go, oh my goodness, you did this. It's like giving you a helping hand here before it gets to, you'd rather we flag this before it goes out live. And yeah, in a way, we're kind of doing part of that mastering engineer's role. And like I was saying, there are certain times when I think absolutely hand it off to a mastering engineer. So probably, and you will agree with me, one of the most painful things to do is a gapless transition.
Yeah.
Especially if you realise after you've received the tracks, maybe not in order in any way that gives you an indication that, track 6 and 7 are actually gapless and I've just mixed them separately. To do that, it's an incredibly painful thing to do. It's one thing trying to do it in Pro Tools, it's other thing trying to do it in other DAWs as well. But even then, you have to be really careful that you haven't messed up your panning data, and also making sure you put your binaural back in if it was different across tracks, or unless you've retained a template that's going across them, so that's okay. Blah 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 blah. It's like, that is such a painful bit of admin to some degree, and that's something that a mastering engineer should and can do with their eyes closed. So it doesn't have that same level of stress, and that's it. So every time I get an engineer that is just facing it for the first time, I'm like, this would be my recommendation, otherwise you'll be up till 3 a.m. And then the next day I come in and they're like, yeah, I was up till 3 a.m. So, but don't be wrong, once you've done it the first time, you generally know how to. But I would have said gapless transitions were outliers. They've come back in fashion.
Yeah.
It's really bizarre to see the increase. It's far more common. So it is something that engineers really, really need to be mindful of when they're taking on projects, to either establish that right at the beginning and then determine how they're going to do it, or whether they're going to recommend, okay, I can do up to this point, I will print with tails, and off to the mastering engineer to finalize. But yeah, so there's still ways to go and things to work out. I think having a mastering engineer means being able to do things like that, being able to manage album balance. I think that's it. It's quite common. We'll get a whole album all at -18. Now, unless they're all the same slamming pop tracks, it's, that ballad's also coming at -18 as well. Yeah. So again, a mastering engineer can kind of do that. The album assembler tool is obviously a huge, huge benefit. I mean, I can't tell you how helpful that is for me on the QC side of things, not just from a production point of view, but actually being able to investigate things. There's always we use different things for different, for different observations, and that's been a great help as well. There are obviously limitations, but those guys are working so hard to keep iterating, and it was better to get it out as it was, and then build and build and build, which is what they're doing. Obviously, the latest version's just been released as well. And yeah, with each of these, it's like, oh, fantastic. This other thing that helps me out massively. And clearly it's clear that engineers are feeling the same, because I'm seeing, it has the default nomenclature with the, underscore mastered. So we can see how much it's being used. But with that at the same time, I'm sorry, I've gone off topic slightly.
Keep going. It's fine.
But I think that's it. It's that kind of more tools are coming in, or current tools are being iterated on, and that all brings its own issues as well, and that we have to be aware of. So we've got situations where you've got things like Logic. You can't change the trim and down mix settings. Pyramix, being as wonderfully efficient as it is, if it sees you haven't used your 0.2 height channels on your 10 bed on your 10 channel bed, then it's only going to print 8. Now, that is very efficient, and I would usually say that's wonderful. I love efficiency. The problem we've got is, depending on what algorithms and what decoding is happening on certain devices, certain streaming services, this, that, and the other, they can conflict with each other, because when they're doing all their testing, they're going, wow, this all seems to work very well. And then it's like, yes, but now this file is now moving on into this other domain. And that's where we're starting to see some issues. So even with the latest Nuendo, there's something that it does that somehow, does this or does that slightly differently, and so it can cause some issues. This is this is not me having a go at any of the DAW manufacturers. These are just the considerations. It is complicated. It is a painful format.
Yeah.
Yet we somehow love it. So it must be that good, because even if I can sit here and say it is horrifically complicated and painful, but the output is beautiful when done well, I'm prepared to fight for it. But that's it. We've still got ways to go.
Excellent. So if you're listening to a lot of mixes, working with a lot of mix engineers, I assume, and helping them in your role as QC, but also in your role as kind of artist or mix engineer relations, I guess. What are some of your favourite mixes? What are some of your favourite mixes? What are you enjoying listening to?
It's interesting you mention the amount that I've listened to. It was for one of my team to tell me that they believe I've listened to over 5,000 tracks or something, which I was just like, it's kind of nuts, but it must be true. And of course, it's all there logged and everything. And I was just like, yeah, I guess that's it. Once you've listened and seen that many workflows, because that's in the region of 400 to 500 engineers across those mixes, you start to see the patterns. And the beautiful thing with that is one of my very first QC engineers that I brought on, Gonzalo Barrera, he was able to take those same observations to the point where I was able to train him up to be an engineer. And now he's one of our engineers. So he's now mixing. And he has taken all of that data on board. And this isn't about stealing people's mix workflows or anything like that. That's about seeing what works and what doesn't.
Yeah.
It's not taking people's secret sauce. You can't really see people's secret sauce.
You can't take someone. That's all in the brain.
Exactly.
That's the personality.
That's exactly right. But what is important is to understand the nuances of those technical workflows and the effect they have on your output. And so, yes, he's been in that kind of privileged position of having that experience, being able to listen to that much and report on it and understand it, to be able to then actually become a very, very, very good engineer that I'm very proud of. But I mean, beyond that, in terms of, what is out there at the moment, I probably wouldn't specify mixes. I think that's very it's very specific. It's more on those that I'm seeing kind of deliver well, and very kind of consistent in their work, and very collaborative. I think that's the really important thing about this format, is that we speak, that we chat, that we discuss. There's things I learn off you, there's things you learn off me, and we keep doing that every single day. There's a nugget of information it is that complicated, and no one's an expert. I know there's some people might go, oh no, but so-and-so's an expert, and you know who I'm talking about, right? But even he would say, oh no, there's still so much to this, and I'm not sitting there in the studio every day, and in that same way, but there'll be this under the hood thing that I might understand more, and there'll be this in studio thing that you might understand, all those kind of things, right? So I think, I think it'd be nice just to take the opportunity to do a bit of a shout out to those that I think are really, really doing it well. And, obviously you're in that list.
Thank you.
I'm not just blowing smoke. No, genuinely, it's been really lovely to engage with you since you guys built this room. And I often reference this room because it's a good way to explain to people how big a near field room can be and how small a near field room can be and things like that. And how well that translation works because you have that specificity, but how you also then, compare and fold down and make sure you're listening to all the translations as well. I mentioned Emery earlier. He's fantastic. Obviously, Giles Martin. I'm very privileged that I actually get to call him a colleague in his role as head of audio and sound at Abbey Road. So we actually collaborate in that way where he's just so open to that engagement, so that we everyone grows together. Stan Kybert is another great engineer. Oh God, now I'm trying to remember everyone. I mean, our internal engineers across all of our studios, our engineers at Abbey Road, Chris Bolster, Lewis Jones, John Barrett, Paul Pritchard, people like Nick Reeves over at Capitol, Kevin Reeves over at Nashville. And then it goes worldwide as well. People like Henka Nimiesto in Finland. Fantastic, absolutely fantastic. Frank Groenbach in Denmark, another wonderful one. Ludovic Tartefel in France, Harold Gerrick in Germany. Who else? I mean, we've just got some really, really great people working on this. We obviously need more women.
Yes.
That is very much lacking. And something
throughout the industry, unfortunately.
Yeah, of course. And of course, that's the thing. It's now in my position of what I'm doing now. I'm doing my best to try and make sure that I can at least try and help the future, and the engineers of tomorrow to come through. So I've been working with engineers over in our Nashville studio and kind of mentoring them. And we're also working on a project that should hopefully be launching in the next few months, where we'll be working with engineers, Derek Ali, to try and promote and elevate female engineers as well. But again, a lot of work in that domain as well. So.
There's so much work still to be done, definitely. It's an area I think we'd all like to see progress being made. Definitely.
Which is why I'm grateful that it's been, I sound a bit sappy when I say this, but Atmos gave me my platform back.
Yeah.
As a female, always have to work harder. That is just fact. It's not an overstatement. It was very much a real experience of mine. I wish I was the person I am now, but I have no regrets. I'm doing a pretty cool job.
Yeah.
I'm living my best life.
Really well.
Thank you very much. No, genuinely. But that was the beauty about this format. No one knew.
Do you feel like it is getting at least a little better in the industry? Do you feel like, because obviously you've come up and experienced probably at its worst, I would say.
Yeah, well, no, to be fair, I'm not that old, Mike.
Well, that's true. Neither of us know what it was like back in the 60s. It's probably horrific.
I think that's it. I think there have been the lucky ones that were, one of the boys and all that kind of stuff. Or, it's almost like, I don't even want to, because it's such a... It's so difficult because it crosses over so many different aspects of diversity, and everyone's lived experience can be very, very different. And yes, I was part of all that nonsense of, not being treated very nicely as well. I don't really want to get into that, but this was all very, very real. I think it potentially was worse prior, but it wasn't much better by the time I got to it. And on the basis that we're still at something like 2% representation in production, it's kind of embarrassing, and we should be doing better. What we need to ensure that we're doing is it's not just about tokenism. It's about elevating and promoting talent and making sure that talent's allowed to get in the door in the first place. That's the problem. They go, well, no one applies. Why should they? It will be the 20th rejection they've had. They have no confidence, and all it does is smash it even more. So no, they didn't apply for that job, but it doesn't mean they're not there. Yeah. So that's the kind of thing that we need to, really need to work on, and something that I'm trying. And again, it's all small steps, and it's frustrating because you want to try and get movement, you want to try and get traction. But I've still got a few years in me, so hopefully I'll get it sorted at some point. Collectively. Can't do it by myself. Yeah.
More than one person's job.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's something that I think everyone across the industry, across all of the major studios, across all of the smaller studios, like across all of the labels, is something we all need to be doing a huge amount more on. Hiring people not just in runner positions and thinking, oh, that's done with, because a lot of those positions are, very little pay. If you're in London, that's nearly impossible unless you're from money, which doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help diversity if the only people who can get a job in this industry don't need it. So there's huge amounts still to be done.
Definitely. But we'll keep fighting the good fight. I say that about Atmos and diversity. They're both, we've got a lot of work to do on both of them.
Absolutely. One of those might be easier than the other.
Yeah.
So back on Atmos then. Techniques and technical things. Let's get a bit in depth for a second. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about was the center channel. Mm-hmm. I know I have opinions on it. I'm sure you do. I like to use it in small amounts. I mean, you've seen my mixes. You know, I will bleed into is how I would kind of refer to it. The center channel. One of the things I'm kind of most proud of is when artists come into the room and they hear the mixes back. One of the comments I had from an artist was, "It sounds like I'm singing to me and I'm over there." And I was like, "Good, that's kind of what I was going for." So the center obviously has a use. There are also some problems with it. Do you want to explain a little bit about how you like to use the center channel and what those issues are?
Absolutely. So I think that's it. There's I see many a forum with Universal don't let you use the center channel. It's like, no, we never said that. I swear to God, read it again. This gentleman's read it. He knows it about it. It doesn't say that. It recommends you might want to consider not using it or using it differently, because the issue we have, and again, this is about, how it advances and all the rest of it. 8 times out of 10, you're getting stereo stems.
Yep.
So you've got this vocal will have effect and you're going to stick it in the center channel alone. Well, what happens?
Yeah, it's not going to work.
Yeah. So, so that's a consideration, right? Then it's like, oh no, I've got the dry and the effects. Okay. Now I'm going to stick the dry in the center, hard, nothing else in it, really expose it. And then it's all right because it will come together with the, the effects in the left and right or whereabouts you choose to put it. I'm sorry, but I've been a vocalist. I'd never like to hear myself try it. It's just horrible. In the same way I'm going to watch this back and not appreciate listening to my own voice. It's the same concept. I think it's a genuine consideration. I know it's been something that's happened in surround for many years, but, my experience is the artist sits down and they go, "Is that dry?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And they go, "Oh, I don't like listening to myself like that." Right. So I think we have to remember, this is the artist, the engineer is not the only person involved in this creative process, and they're not the first either. No. So I think we do need to think about the artist when we're making these decisions. It's not some arrogant kind of, universal perspective where we're saying, "Oh, don't use it." It's like, no, because we're always trying to think about everyone in this situation, the consumer as well as the artist, from one end to the other, right? So I think you have to be very, very careful. As well as that, especially when in those kind of stereo into a mono scenario, it really narrows that sound, right?
Yeah, it really does.
It really does. To the point where they sound like they're over there, not here. Don't get me wrong, depending on the divergence or how exactly that's been positioned, and I don't want to get overly technical about it. Sometimes it can, exactly to your point, what you're saying, your technique gives you that intimacy, right? And that can work beautifully. So I think it's just spending the right amount of time on that. The other thing everyone has to remember is people have spent the best part of 50 years listening to a phantom center vocal. They have rarely ever listened to it any other way. And we're trying to help people understand a new format. And if we go in with all the craziness of what this format can do, immediately, it's not going to help in that process of trying to get people on board, right? So you've got someone that's A-being, you know, and I'll always allow them that, because that's the thing they always panic about. They're like, what's my reference? I've never heard it like this. How am I going to know? And I'm like, well, you start from, do you like it or not?
Yeah.
And then we can go from there, you know. But I give them their stereo on A and the Atmos on B, and they can switch as much as they like. And that's it. If you've got this kind of very narrowed centre vocal and they're switching between, and yes, in isolation, one could argue, well, yeah, but if they listen to it in isolation, it'll be fine. And it's like, yes, but they need to be able to make an educated decision. And if you're not giving them the tools, then that's unfair, you know?
Yeah.
So I may be going a little bit rabbit hole on this, but it's because I guess we feel so passionately about being part of the conversation and being collaborative in that. And when I do see a lot of this kind of, oh, Universal says this, what do they know? And it's like, I promise it comes from a point of caring. And it's, if you read it clearly, it never says, don't do it. No. It says, you know, these are recommendations. It's consider this, you know, because you have to look at the assets that you have and what you've got to work with and what you're going to do with it. Does that answer that question?
I think so,
Did I go a bit too...
No, I think that answers the question. It's that thing of treating the song first and not the technology first.
Yes.
Do what works to make the music sound like you think the song ought to sound, and don't do the thing that you think makes the technology sound like you think the technology should sound, because that is terrible.
Exactly.
And it was definitely an issue with a lot of very early Atmos things, and a lot of the demos that were going around were done in a way that showed off the technology, which is fine, and it has a purpose, because it shows me what I can do and sometimes what I shouldn't do.
It's exactly that. And, you know, there's this other kind of argument, well, once it goes in theatrical, then the vocal's off, you know, off piece, depending on where you're sitting. It's like, but it's not intended for theatrical. You should go and make sure you mix it for theatrical, because it's meant for near field. Then that's so that image shouldn't shift in that way. It depends how much you're doing LCR, how much you're weighting it in that way. Then yes, you could shift your phantom image if you're particularly wide in a particularly wide room. But you know, realistically, it is meant for, you know, a near field environment. So I think it's you can't completely dismiss phantom center as an option. And that's the thing. I kind of say with the center and the LFE. My general statement is, just because it's there doesn't mean you have to use it. And going back to what you were saying, you have to look at the song. Is it pertinent? Does it make sense for that song to have this stuff fed through these places? We have to remember, that was a dialogue speaker, and that was for the tanks rumbling through. But that was what it was there for, you know, so we now have to think carefully. In the same way we don't have a picture reference, how do we create a stimuli purely from audio that's going to give an experience without having the visual stimuli of telling you what's happening? You know? So it's that same kind of thing, thinking very carefully about how we use this space. So I'm absolutely not saying don't use the centre, but use it appropriately. And then while we're on it, again, same with LFE. Yeah. Use it appropriately. You know, I've heard some incredible hip hop mixes where the engineer just doesn't want to use it. And that's absolutely fine. And no one will go, well, no one's got a full range system like yours is. No. And that's the beauty of the crossover, right? And bass management. That stuff's going to end up in the sub anyway, right? So don't worry about it, right? It won't be as discreet. It's going to be more, you know, but you'll get the bottom end. It's not going anywhere, right? And I think that's it, trying to help other engineers kind of understand that difference between bass management, filtering your LFE, phase coherence, all these kind of things. They're all really, really important, and they all play a part in, you know, the suitability for that mix. Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, that's very much how we would use the LFE, especially, is like you should be able to turn it off, and you'll notice, but not really. You don't want to feel like the song suddenly doesn't have something that should be there.
Exactly, absolutely. Should always be an enhancement. It's never, you should, exactly that. You should be able to switch it off and the song still holds up. Yeah. It's just that little, because now you've got it. You know, it's like there's so many songs where you look at the stems and you think, no one will have ever heard all this beautiful sub in this particular track, and now they can. Absolutely. Let's get that up there, because it feels like it was where it wanted to be, but couldn't be heard before necessarily.
And then another of the kind of tech nerdy things that I'd like to talk to you about is the binaural, all the different options that come from that, and let's mention the elephant in the room, the Apple version, and how that sounds. So binaural, I guess. Just big question mark.
I think that's it. Again, we're still in those stages where we need to. There's still more finessing to happen, right? But we know that we have definitely 2 representations. There's a third, which I should touch on.
Yeah,
I think let's get it all out. Let's get it all on the table, because I think there's still a lot of engineers that may not necessarily know about it. So yes, we've got our Dolby binaural, we've got our Apple spatial and binaural representation there, and then we've got Apple Music users non-Apple headset device. So either Bluetooth of another manufacturer or plugging in, hardwiring headphones in. That's the third representation. Now, there's a lot of this, I'm not going to put any binaural metadata because Apple don't read it anyway. Okay, well, yeah, but Apple is only one of the providers of immersive audio. There's still users that pay money to Amazon and Tidal, so let's give them the same respect. And
other brands could come on board at any time.
Other brands could come on board at any time, right? So, and also what's good to know, if this is the logic you're going with, is the Apple Part 2 actually is reading the binaural metadata.
Yes.
Because it's working in a different way, it is able to read it. Of course, it's still based on their algorithm combined with binaural metadata, but it's just good to note. So if you do nothing or try and switch it all off or keep it all mid or whatever, that's going to be represented in that one. So it is highly recommended to use binaural metadata, and where possible to deviate from the default. There are some exceptions to that default. I think especially when we've got situations where ambient miking has been used, which of course would kind of cause all kinds of weird phase stuff if you've already got these positions in the right places, then you're going to change essentially change the size of it almost. But yeah, really, really take advantage of it. And I think, 373, I think, that was a major improvement on the default binaural, for me anyway, because even I'm one of the people that are like, but I also understand that as it iterates, it's only getting better. It's not going backwards to a point where you're like, well, none of that makes sense of that binaural metadata I put in 2 years ago. No. It's actually, the idea is that what you put in then should start sounding better and more representative of what you actually wanted to do.
So if I can just go back a little bit. 373, I assume you mean the version of the Dolby renderer.
Yes, I'm so sorry. 3.7.3 Dolby Atmos renderer,
yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, so that, and with that came a new set of the interpretation of your metadata. Would that be the right way of describing that?
I think it was kind of taking it an extra step, basically.
Kind of changed what mid did.
Yeah. So, but in a way that, anything that was previously, whatever settings it was previously, it's only improving upon that experience in general. I know some may argue, but it just meant from a default perspective, it was kind of easier to interpret. I strongly recommend to anyone that hasn't already to download and install their own personalized HRTF config. So you can literally Google Dolby PHRTF, and that will take someone straight to that website where they can sign up, download the app, do the spinny head thing, and get their config, and that helps tremendously.
It's a huge difference for me working on it. I'm interested to see how that then rolls out for consumers, because it's one thing for me to sit there and go, well, if I take it off the default binaural config, it sounds way better. But where does that hit?
But think about it. If it's now doing the best for your ears, that technically means that the settings that you choose are potentially going to be better for that track overall.
Yes.
So the intention would be that it's then received better on a default HRTF, as opposed to you working default where you can't really hear the representation as well, right? It's, again, contentious. People may disagree or argue with me.
I would love to see consumers be able to I understand that there are all sorts of technical constraints, mostly to do with data, and quite how much of it you need to send to the phone and have that do the work, or whatever the device is. But yeah, it's such a big difference going from default to my own personal HRTF that I would love to be able to think at some point consumers can do the same thing.
That's it. And to some degree they can. I mean, the Apple AirPods have now got personalised HRTF. Of course, everyone's maths and physics around these things are slightly different. I mean, to that point, there is no way you will ever get Dolby Binaural sounding exactly like Apple Spatial. It's, different algorithms, different considerations. There's all the different parts around the head tracking and everything that Apple have to consider in designing their room, and all these kind of things. So they will be different. I wouldn't try and match them because you'll never win. And also you have to remember that these algorithms, these are firmware updates that can happen at any point. So whatever your Apple spatial mix might sound like today, it could be a deviation by next month. So that's not a big issue if you've mixed to your room and your binaural consecutively. If you've gone through that process and you're mixing across them, checking them, and you're doing that as part of your overall end-to-end process, and you understand that translation, you're generally good. If you've purely mixed to Apple Spatial and purely mixed in headphones, then that's probably potentially has the risk of sounding great today, but deviate in a negative way in a month's time. Yeah. So I always say to everyone, as long as it's solid in your room, it's translated well on binaural, it's translated well on Apple Spatial, it's translated well on a consumer system, then you're probably good to go. And of course, I'm sure you've got the same thing as well. Once you recognise the nuances of the different translations, there are, you can make better judgments without necessarily referencing that immediately and things like that, right?
Oh yeah, you kind of know to a degree after you've worked with it for a while what's going to happen, and you still check it. Yeah. But there are various sounds where I'm like, I know this needs to be near, I know that this needs to be mid, and then you put the headphones on, and maybe 1 in 100 times it turns out I'm wrong. Yeah. But most of the time you're like, that sounds like what I expected to sound like. Yeah. We can move on again.
Exactly. I think that's it. Once you really get into it, so much of it is visual, and that can be really create efficiencies in your workflow as well. But not to be complacent in relying on those, to your point, and to the point of the fact that these algorithms update. So always remaining on top of things and knowing what it's doing.
Okay, one final question then, please, on the technical side, and we're getting even more into the weeds, as it were, here. In your latest version of your spec sheet, there was a setting that I noticed we weren't previously using, and I had been exploring and didn't really understand, which is the 5.1 down mix settings. And the new version, which is at this point about a year old, suggested that we switch to direct render. Why is that? What does the direct render do? And why is it important that that's a setting?
So I think firstly it's important to understand this was a film and TV. This is a post-production software tool, right? This wasn't intended for music. It's ended up coming into our world. So a lot of the defaults and a lot of these settings are based on those kind of historic decisions. And low row, this default setting, is basically trying to protect a 5.1 or 5.1.x listener from what will happen to the mix if their room, say, isn't calibrated, or they've got a 5.1 surround sound system at home and maybe the speakers aren't in the right place and all this kind of stuff, right? So that's why low row was come up with. It was basically to say we're going to try and avoid doing too much imaging, kind of phantom imaging, and to keep it safe, anything that was kind of around here will throw to the front, and anything around here will throw to the back. So now all of a sudden you've lost any comprehension of side imaging. And I think that's a great shame, because you've spent all your time putting it there. And the reality is a lot of the consumer devices are working off this re-render. So the to say something like a Sonos, you've got a Sonos Arc with your ones, but you've got no sides, right? So we're on a 4. What?
I do.
Great. So now you're in a 5.1 world, right? So that situation is going to happen. Even the latest Sonos Era 300, again, that's working off a 5.1.2 render, as far as I can recall. Please, someone correct me if I'm wrong. And some of the vehicles. Now, most vehicles, they're going with 7.1.4, so that's good. Some are still in a 5.1.2 or 5.1.4 domain. We're now in environments that are, this is making this low-row setting historic and redundant. These are environments that are fixed or well-calibrated. Even with my Sonos system, it's not in a particularly great space. I'm in a Victorian with a fireplace in the way and all this kind of stuff. So I don't have that central position. But doing that wonderful TruePlay thing, my goodness, I'm sorry, I'm sounding like an advert for Sonos. But it's connected the room together very, very well. The car obviously fixed positions, smart speakers and single speaker or single unit devices, fixed positions. So you don't have to worry about those speakers being in the wrong place. So now you can have your side imaging and not have to worry about it. So when you switch it to direct render, that's exactly what happens. Your side imaging comes back. And as long as you're listening in a calibrated room or one of these fixed speaker kind of things, then that will represent well. Now, sometimes people will say, no, I prefer low row. And so my argument there would be potentially one of two things. I would wonder why you don't just put all your stuff to the front or the back and just don't ever use the sides. Or alternatively, it could be if you've gone and switched your room down to 5.1 to see how it translates, you're probably going to get a bit of phase because you may not have necessarily calibrated your room to a 5.1 room, right? So just because you've got the speakers there in roughly the right place, your room's been calibrated to 7.1, 9.1, 11.1, whatever. So none of these things are going to be necessarily in the right place and playing at the right levels, this, that, and the other, etc., etc. So yes, it may sound like you're getting comb filtering or whatever else when you then fold it down to 5.1 and go, no, I'm going to go with low row. So all I would say is consider that as an option, because I don't want to force people. The fact is, at the moment, we're stuck because there's the limitation in the down mix, trim and down mix settings in Logic. We can't, we can't enforce it, but we strongly encourage it, and because we do think it is the best way to represent what it is that you were trying to do, and retain your creative intent, as well as the artist. So I guess that's why I'm a bit of a stickler for it, but always happy for the conversation.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for coming along, and I hope to see you again soon.
Definitely. Thanks so much for having me, Mike.
Brilliant.